Welcome to the Daily Word, verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Hebrews. Keep in mind, I am using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so if you're using a different translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. Also, keep in mind that these Daily Word, verse by verse studies are uploaded to my YouTube channel, BP The Bible Perspective. That's BP The Bible Perspective. So like and subscribe to BP The Bible Perspective, and like and share these videos. Okay, we're in chapter 5. We're going to pick it up at verse 7. Now, the writer is comparing or pointing out that Jesus is superior than the high priest. He can be likened to a high priest in terms of his mediator work between God and man, but he is superior to any earthly high priest. The writer points out that Jesus did, just as Aaron did not take upon himself this honor that God called him, Jesus was ordained and called by God as a high priest. And we could say the high priest. I just want to make one more thought, because I said this at the last of the last video. In the New Testament, we do not have high priests to stand between God and man. Jesus is that. What we do have, and the reason why I say that is because there is this thought that people have that the ministers, the clergy, are kind of a priest between God and man, that they stand between God and man. And many of them have arrogantly asserted that. And that's not true. The New Testament ministry gift, apostle, prophet, pastors, evangelists, and teachers have a different function to minister, to teach, to build up the body of Christ. All right, so they are not high priests in any way, and they do not have a greater advantage or class or privilege than anyone other in the body of Christ, okay? Now, I'm going to go back to verse 5. I'm going to pick it up at verse 6, but I'm going to, for continuity's sake, I'm going to start reading in verse 5. In the same way, the Messiah did not exalt himself to become a high priest, but the one who said to him, "You are my son, today I have become your father," also said in another passage, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Now, verse 7, during his earthly life, this is referring to Jesus, he had offered prayers and appeals with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Now, the statement seems to focus, if you go back and read in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night that Jesus was betrayed and arrested. Well, before that, he spent time, what's called the Last Supper, and then and after the supper was ended, they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. This was a spot that Jesus and them often resorted to. And there he prayed. He spent some 3 hours there in prayer. Luke says that angels appeared, strengthening him. And the intensity of that prayer was such that he sweated blood. His blood was mixed with sweat. Angels appeared and strengthening him. So this appeal to be saved from death, and that's what you find that one of the things he prayed, that he said, "Lord, if this cup can pass from me, let it pass from me." So we know the intensity that he felt. And by the way, and again, remember, the writer here is taking us through the human journey of Jesus as the Son of God, however, okay? Yet without sin. So let's make sure we stress that. So it says that he prayed, again, from his earthly life, he prayed that God would save him from death. Notice he said he was heard because of his reverence, verse 8. Though he was a son, though he was God's son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. That's kind of interesting how we take this. We don't have a lot of details in terms of the dynamic between the earthly nature of Jesus Christ and his divine nature. He was 100% man, 100% human. So as a human, he felt, he experienced. He wasn't human-like. He wasn't in human form. He was 100% human. He had a beating heart, breathing lungs, okay? He urinated. He did number two. He slept. He got tired. He had to eat, okay? So he had everything, you know. He didn't look like a Ken doll. So if you take off his clothes, no, he had genitals, okay? So my point is, he was human in every sense of the way. Jesus was human in every sense of the way. And in every way you can, and as such, he experienced humanity in every sense of the way. Okay? And so he says, at verse 9, after he was perfected, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obeyed him. And he was declared by God to be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now again, I'm going to get into Melchizedek in the upcoming chapters because it's important to understand here why he's making the Melchizedek association. And that is, understand this. Jesus being higher than Melchizedek, Melchizedek was higher than any Israelite priest. Okay? Any Israelite priest. And again, we'll get into more detail in the upcoming chapters. So he says that he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Now the term obey him is the gospel claim, faith, believing in him. All right, verse 11 says, we have a great deal to say about this, and it is difficult to explain since you've become lazy to understand. Now this is kind of an interesting rebuke. Now again, remember, the writer is talking to those Hebrews who should have received and have obeyed the gospel by now. They should have. They should have obeyed the gospel, but they haven't. And notice what he says, that they're too lazy to understand. In other words, they don't want to understand. Not that they can't, he said, but they're too lazy to. He says, verse 12, although by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the basic principles of God's revelation again. You need milk and not solid food. Now, everyone who lives on milk is inexperienced with the message about righteousness because he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, for those whose senses have been trained to distinguish between good and evil. Now, one of the sense of pride that sometimes we face is we always like to refer to ourselves as mature Christians. Well, I'm not a baby Christian, I'm a mature Christian. Paul rebukes them. And by the way, knowledge itself doesn't determine maturity. And so you could have a person who could have a PhD in theology, and yet Paul, the writers, by the writer's standard here, he can still be a babe. What makes a person mature versus immature? A babe, right? Notice he says that they have not exercised or trained their senses to discern good and evil. Now the good and evil, of course, as he's referring here, is what is right about what God is doing. What is the message? Now, Paul rebuked the Corinthians, calling them babes because of their fightings, their schisms, their fighting, the diffractions. I'm with this person, I'm with that person. And Paul said that was immature, okay? And notice he says, you ought to be teachers by now. You ought to be teachers of the word. You ought to be teachers of the gospel. Now, unfortunately, there are some churches that don't teach, and therefore the people are not mature. And that, to me, one of the most saddest things was, in some respect, this is why I'm doing the daily word verse by verse, because of the lack of teaching. And I would say most churches, but certainly a lot of churches. And so therefore the people only think in accordance to their theology. They think only in accordance to how they've been taught in their denominations. But you still see that they have immature qualities, right? They curse you out, they fuss, they fight, they have factions. Look at now, even in the political climate that we live in now, that people divide over you know, political figures. Okay. Okay, guys, we're going to pick it up at chapter 6 in the next video. I'll see you then.